By 10 a.m. in the Austin battle, as coalition forces had by now captured all of their objectives within the Austin battle space, as the Russian Army's 207th Motor Rifle Division, a part of the larger 2nd Combined Arms Army, along with the Chinese paramilitary forces present, or their parallel military forces, which included the People's Armed Police within their 43rd PAP Brigade, their 130th PAP Artillery Regiment, and of course the 250th National Construction Battalion of the National Construction and Production Corps, or simply just National Construction Corps, as these forces were now in the process of consolidating all of their recent gains. The fighting in Austin, however, was not over yet, as one of the 130th PAP Artillery Regiment's 3 firing battalions had moved to a new firing position within Austin city limits along the Colorado River. They now had set up to prepare to cover a much wider area to the south, but also to the north and even east as well from their new firing positions. And this was conducted as a direct result of Serb forces to the south within the San Antonio battle space, moving north and slightly east into New Braunfels, and then into a city known as Kyle to the south of another city, one of the outermost southern suburbs of Austin, known as Buda. As these forces, namely the Serbs of their 1st Brigade of the Serbian Army, were fighting the local American armed reactionary civilian combatants in the area, many had opted to flee from the vengeful Serbs who never forgot 1999 and everything else before that had happened to their country that they had blamed directly on the American regime and more broadly the nation as a whole, as they gladly joined the coalition, not only due as a result of various defense pacts and even economic pacts made with both the Chinese and Russians respectively, but also they wanted to come along as part of a punitive expedition within which they would be most pleased to assist the coalition leadership of China and Russia in this endeavor, as they now had eliminated large groupings in the multiple hundreds of armed reactionary civilians to the south. 1,000 of them had fled north pertaining to these armed reactionary civilians and were now beginning to near the Austin battle space. As a result, they were instantaneously seen even as they were leaving the San Antonio battle space and falling or picking up other armed civilians as they headed north by the constellation of altitude reconnaissance drones, in addition to the even higher altitude constellation of satellites, of all of the military satellites of China and also Russia, but even smaller coalition member states who also contributed their limited numbers of military satellites as well. As the high-altitude reconnaissance drones in the San Antonio battle space had steadily picked them up and monitored them as they were leaving the area, the forces in the Austin battle space were fully aware that there was a grouping of approximately 1,000 armed reactionary civilians moving into the Austin battle space, And as they passed the city of Buda, they now moved towards the town of Creedmoor. And as the People's Armed Police had a battalion that had originated in the Del Valle area and cleared the flanks more broadly of the larger operation occurring in the Austin battle space, they had earlier veered to the slight southwest and engaged a smaller grouping of armed reactionary civilians and had essentially roughly halved their number, as just over 150 were now fleeing towards the town of Creedmoor and were spotted the whole way again by the ISR assets of the coalition. As the People's Armed Police Battalion had briefly stopped after this skirmish, which had eliminated a fairly decent amount of these armed reactionary civilians in this grouping, to conduct a logistical resupply, they were now once again in hot pursuit and were moving into the Creedmoor area, guided in their movements at all times by the ISR constellation of high-altitude drone and satellite assets above those, and even at the lowest levels by their own quadcopter assets, which steadily mapped the area around their unit as they moved into the area in real time, viewing everything that essentially going on, including all of the placements of hostile elements in addition to friendly elements, namely the comprising combat companies of their own battalion in addition to their headquarters and support company, as they were made up of, again, 7 combat companies and a headquarters and support company, which made up the entire battalion moving into this area. As they were very ready for what they were about to conduct insofar as an operation, they had decided to shape the battlefield into what would become a terrifying kill box of sorts, as the PAP would move into the area, which essentially on the eastern outskirts of Creedmoor consisted of 2 highway networks, which were essentially tollways, as to the west was I-35, but in the eastern portions of Creedmoor, the 183 tollway that literally went by the international airport moved north to south, as well as also the tollway known as 45 that moved east to west, but then changed into 130 as it veered north-south as well. As there was an intersection of these tollways on the eastern outskirts of Creedmoor in this area, the People's Armed Police would use these as a means to establish their kill box. They would use their ISR assets to watch the area for all hostile activities of the American forces so that they could tailor their movements accordingly. And they would race beneath one of the highway underpasses along the 183 tollway and would effectively line up in multiple companies, which would effectively be 3 companies from north to south, and would pivot facing west, while a 4th company would race down on the other side of the 183 tollway moving south before basically turning to the west and moving to cut off the line of retreat of the American forces moving into this particular area so that they could not turn back and go back from whence they came. As they were moving into this area, there would be traffic jams, as in this part of Creedmoor, as we go to the map of the area, this was effectively the 45 tollway, and this was the 183 tollway. 45 continued before veering to the north, becoming 130. This was the eastern outskirts of Creedmoor, wherein there were many different small and medium commercial businesses, car dealerships, and new homes being built, including in this cul-de-sac with this destroyed swimming pool behind this large home that had been shelled by the time this battle opens up. As, again, this had been crafted into a kill box simply by utilizing the ISR assets to guide the PAP ground forces into moving into this area, driving south and north respectively upon passing under this highway underpass, and then pivoting their vehicles to face the west, as they had, again, a fourth company out of their 7 total combat companies, with 3 combat company elements spread out facing west from the north to the south. The fourth company would drive behind the 183 tollway and would, again, near where the intersection of these highways was, turn and move to the west. But that would occur after these forces had effectively gotten into place and prepared for battle. The People's Armed Police, with their 43rd PAP Brigade's headquarters battalion, had their dedicated combat drone section with their 48-tube TEL-like system fire a volley of CH-901A loitering munitions in direct support of their forces in the south of this area of operations, as well as also there being 3 of the 10 Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones, which had by now been reloaded with fresh air-to-ground munitions, as all 10 of these combat drones, upon the objectives having had all been seized by 10 a.m., had returned to their ad hoc landing strips to effectively be met by ground crews, reloaded, and sent back directly into immediate operations, as by now, after the PAP had engaged in the skirmish around 10, they had, by then, conducted their logistical resupply efforts and were once again in hot pursuit, moving towards Creedmoor after the remains of the forces that fled, and would meet up with the 1,000 armed reactionary civilians moving north. As the objectives, again, were all captured in the Austin battle. The Austin battle was not over yet, because there were a few flare-ups before this battle would be completely over. And now it was simply a matter of the coalition forces consolidating their positions and eliminating the last of the armed resistance in this battle space, as there would also be other armed resistance moving in from elsewhere, namely from the west of this battle space, from the Edwards Plateau. A large militia force of roughly several thousand in total strength would move from the Edwards Plateau, overlooking this battle space, to assault one of 2 headquarters battalions, which were brigade headquarters battalions within the 207th Motor Rifle Division, as these forces would effectively find themselves under attack a bit later. However, for the time being, at noon on day 1 of the invasion, this battle in Creedmoor was effectively underway. And it wouldn't be so much of a battle as it would be a complete and total display of concentrated firepower in one relatively small area, namely on the eastern outskirts of Creedmoor, a 1.5 mile area north to south by 2 mile area east to west, as People's Armed Police forces had effectively conducted some operations where they burned down some buildings suspected of harboring some of the earlier fleeing armed reactionary civilians who had already now since moved under this highway, as these forces rapidly moved and deployed facing west from the very south by the access road of the tollway to its northernmost end of this battle space, as there were still, in addition to these three combat elements of these three combat companies, minus their headquarters and command elements, which were their headquarters platoons, which were further back as their logistical and command elements of each of these three combat companies, and also this fourth combat company moving into the area. With this squad hurriedly deploying back into their APC, back into their WZ-551 after burning these buildings down, and moving south to conduct this movement, which would occur while all of this fighting was now unfolding, as there were many dismounted Americans by this point in time, as well as also Americans still mounted up in large numbers in their technicals throughout this entire battle space. There were even some that were on the tollways themselves, such as right here, hurriedly trying to flee the battle space. This is the highway segment, and these are the access roads on either side of it. And CH-901As were destroying these technicals, trying to utilize this as a means of escape, as more loitering munitions were moving in over the forces as they were all lined up on the access road with their IFV versions of the WZ-551, with their powerful remote control weapon station with its 30mm autocannon and 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun beneath. And then there were the APC versions with their heavy machine gun turrets with their W85 12.7mm machine guns, which, as each platoon had one IFV and 4 APCs. The three combat companies with their three combat platoons each, minus, of course, again, their headquarters platoons, which were the command and logistical elements, were all lined up along this access road. This is a grassy field right here, and over top of it are flying their CH-901A loitering munitions with their quadcopter platoon-level assets of these PAP forces scouting the area ahead. Much like in this image with one right here, where this flamethrower operator is burning down this home. Similar was occurring in this area, again, behind the tollway, as they were cleaning up the area behind it to clear the flanks for these forces who were lining up with the headquarters platoons of each of these three combat companies sitting further back in their star formations with their MRAPs to protect their lighter logistical and command vehicles of these combat companies with their headquarters platoons. As the combat platoons were all lined up, they were already in engagements with armed reactionary civilian dismounts, some of whom had just fled beneath this highway segment and were now turning around to meet the threat that was firing at them as it pertained to these PAP forces who were firing from their WZ-551 armored fighting vehicles and their IFV and APC versions. As the heavy machine gun fire, 30mm autocannon fire especially, and 7.62 by 54mm coax fire from beneath the autocannons on the IFVs were absolutely devastating, as the 12.7mm even alone was enough to annihilate large groupings of dismounts as well as soft-skinned vehicles, which it had no problem shredding right through, nor even light armored vehicles in some cases. As the 30mm autocannon was a completely different story, with its HE armor-piercing ammunition capable of impacting areas like grenades that could penetrate heavy armor, which could annihilate infantry fighting vehicles and lighter, as in the American Bradley was simply no match for a 30mm autocannon with HE armor-piercing ammunition, or simply the tungsten-based armor-piercing ammunition, which would shred right through it with ease, and any vehicles lighter than that. However, the American Abrams main battle tank could not be overcome by these vehicles' weapon systems, but there was no danger of that by this point, as the American forces' heaviest combat elements, the second of the 198th, had been annihilated by the combination of companies from a Russian armored battalion, one of two within the 207th Motor Rifle Division, and even a single company guarding the rear flanks of the operations to clear armed reactionary civilians at the very beginning of the operation, which both worked together to crush these forces from two directions with heavy artillery support from People's Armed Police artillery forces, namely firing batteries from within the battalion that had begun in Pflugerville from the 130th Artillery Regiment, having fired in support of both the Russian allies and their own forces in the area. As now, People's Armed Police artillery from the other firing battalion that had moved position to the Colorado River were now well within range to, again, cover a wider area as it pertained to giving the entire regiment, the 130th, the capabilities to cover broad swathes of the battlefield and even beyond, as these artillery firing battalions even had intersecting fields of fire in terms of areas where multiple of these three battalions could focus on one area all at once if need be, depending on where in the battlefield it actually was, while also still having, again, the broad opportunity to target other areas that were further afield. And now, this area, known as Creedmoor, was well within range for the Type 59-I or -1 howitzers that comprised the People's Armed Police firing batteries within their artillery regiment's 3 firing battalions. As these howitzers, when fired in massed fire operations, in terms of fire missions that were all fired into a relatively small area with multiple systems firing at one target area, were absolutely devastating, especially when the fire at will command was given, and these forces would then fire rapidly in terms of constantly reloading and firing shells at the same target, causing total devastation thereupon. As all of the artillery was ISR guided, even Russian artillery, to a limited extent, would be fired in this battle as well from the larger Russian self-propelled 2S-19 MSTA howitzers firing their 152 millimeter shells, whereas the PAP artillery was lighter. It was a mid-caliber artillery piece as a 130 millimeter howitzer, as there were smaller howitzers such as 105 and 122 millimeter, for instance, which the 122 millimeter was also used by People's Armed Police, having had been passed down from the PLA just as the Type 59-Is had been. But these howitzers were again a mid-powered caliber of artillery howitzer, although they certainly didn't stack up to the 152 or 155 millimeter shells, and especially not the 203 millimeter howitzer shells, which were effectively the largest in service anywhere at the moment. But they were definitely very potent again when fired in concentrated form, and they would indeed be fired en masse in this battle as People's Armed Police forces, supported by 3 Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drones and 48 CH-901A loitering munitions, in addition to the combat drones, which were all armed with CM-502KG dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles, which could actually penetrate battleship armor. Why they were known as dual-purpose missiles. That's how powerful their penetration abilities were. And also the long anti-tank known as H-10, which was a very powerful missile, although it didn't quite have the precision of the SOT, but was nonetheless still very powerful and a scourge against tanks and other vehicles. And it had quite a range to it with over 6 miles. As these forces now were fully engaged, the small arms, these armed reactionary civilians, were equipped with a host of different small arms, mostly sporting rifles, which were effectively, for the most part, tantamount to military weaponry, although it didn't have any 3-round burst options or full automatic options. The semi-auto option was what most militaries utilized anyway on their rifles when firing for accuracy in terms of the standard rifleman. However, there were, of course, times where 3-round burst options and full automatic could be used, but for the most part, the sporting rifles gave the standard armed civilian the same fire as a military rifleman in most armed forces. However, not all of the reactionary civilians were equipped with, and some standard hunting rifles of different calibers, and if trying to effectively establish a logistical network for all of the different rifles and calibers in use, it would have been a nightmare. But these were ad hoc forces. These were not a well-organized force. These were not a well-coordinated force. These were ad hoc American armed reactionary forces that were reacting to the invaders as matters developed. And as all of these vehicles were fleeing the area, being heavily shelled at the opening of this map, with all of these vehicles outright annihilated with all of their armed combatants in them, in the beds of the trucks or within the SUVs, and plenty more beneath these blast icons of the Chinese artillery fires. As all of these imminent strike markers indicate that all of these vehicles that were outside of the outer blast radius or beneath them would be hit and destroyed, as some of them tried to move in other ways and move through here, and were hit by artillery strikes, which simply also annihilated dismounts, just the same as it did the vehicles themselves. And as these vehicles moved through the area, they became easy targets for the Wingloong 2 dedicated combat drones, who effectively swooped down and fired their CM502 KGs or their HJ-10s. As these smoke trails go further back, they had been fired from further away and were targeting multiple different vehicles. There was even a Wingloong 2 that fired off all 12 of its armaments at various targets which were further afield, and this effectively was resultant from a traffic jam being created due to the fleeing armed reactionary civilians from earlier that had fled these People's Armed Police forces of this battalion, moving through the highway underpass and into this area, getting into a traffic jam with the armed reactionary civilians moving north and then veering on this road to the northeast, not aware whatsoever at all that they were running into a massive PAP-laid trap that was all directed by ISR assets, of which the Americans had none, and that needs to be understood at all times. All they had was the ability to utilize scouts and basically line-of-sight optics, such as binoculars and other optical equipment that could allow them to see for further distances as long as there were no obstructions. However, this could only do so much and would not be any bit as effective as the ISR capabilities held by these People's Armed Police forces moving into the area. As the aircraft had returned for their third sorties, namely the JF-17Bs of the Chinese, PLAAF and the Russian Su-34, very powerful strike aircraft reloaded for new missions, had all returned, yet again as mentioned, for their third sorties, with the Chinese fighter aircraft, as the JF-17B was capable of carrying just over 9,000 pounds, as the original JF-17 could carry much less. These aircraft would be loaded down with their free-fall munitions, at least the pair of JF-17Bs operating in this kill box battle space, along with napalm canisters, which could devastate a relatively wide area with incendiary destruction. And the Russians, of course, were armed with free-fall munitions, as well as a pair of Russian Su-34s from their Su-34 squadron, specifically earmarked for just this Austin battle space alone, just as the JF-17B squadron was earmarked for just this battle space alone, would each again contribute 2 aircraft of each type, as the pair of PLAAF JF-17Bs would enter this kill box, and a pair of Russian Su-34s would enter this kill box. The artillery firepower poured down into this area by both the Russian and Chinese howitzers, along with, of course, the Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drones, of which there were 3, and the 48 CH-901A loitering munitions, along with the very powerful ground-based firepower of the vehicles in use by the People's Armed Police. They're very fast, nimble, and decently armored WZ-551 armored fighting vehicles, as these gave the PAP a high degree of mobility as well as firepower, especially with the upgunned 30mm auto cannon, were simply devastating against enemy targets, as the People's Armed Police would not even bother dismounting any of their squads from within their vehicles. They would effectively all sit lined up with all of their intersecting fields of fire between all of these vehicles, capable of all engaging the same targets wherever they had interlocking fields of fire between all these vehicles, or engaging single targets on their own, as these vehicles were lined up in a long row of 3 full companies, along with a 4th company moving south rapidly as this squad was mounting back up in its APC, and this arrow indicates they're all moving to the south before they hook and go in this direction. This battle would not last long whatsoever at all, as before the map even opened up, artillery had destroyed these brand new homes in this cul-de-sac, including the swimming pool, which was now a crater of shattered concrete, and also businesses in the area along these roads near the highway, as car dealerships and restaurants and other small businesses in the area were being shattered by the concentrated artillery fire, along with all the armed reactionary civilians spotted by the ISR constellation that were congregating in these areas as they had moved up from the south, moving north from this underpass. The loitering munition strikes, again, destroyed those trying to take to the highway system, as well as also the Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drones destroying these vehicles in this area, moving to where their forces were in this thickly wooded area, as this was an area of grassy fields of very tall grass, wooded terrain, and there was even a ranch in the northwest corner of this particular map, as this was again the outskirts of Creedmoor on its eastern end of the town itself, these moving would move into this area and veer off in different directions, but all the artillery impact markers indicate, along with all of these missiles fired from the Winglung 2s, would destroy these forces. With the air-dropped munitions, including these thousands of pounds of free-fall munitions, as this JF-17B did a slight dive before dropping all of its payload, including the 4 napalm canisters, which devastated a wide area, destroying all of these armed reactionary civilian vehicles, along with the personnel inside, as well as artillery strikes hitting the area as well, including these already destroyed buildings being hit yet again by artillery strike markers as these vehicles were moving into the area and got into a traffic jam, with other forces having fled under this highway underpass as the PAP pursued them and then fanned out. These forces here in this wooded area had likewise moved through this area, but now turned back around and got into a shooting match between they and the PAP vehicles, of which their small arms could do literally absolutely nothing whatsoever at all. And the loitering munitions of the total 48 that were fired, which were circling the battlefield, loitering over the battlefield, were engaging multiple targets, along with the airdropped ordnance from the JF-17Bs and the very powerful Su-34s, dropping 10,000 pounds of ordnance each just on the first pass alone, as they could carry 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance as it pertained to the Su-34s, and the JF-17B could carry, again, just over 9,000. As this was a fighter aircraft, although it could be used in a multi-role capacity, this was a dedicated strike aircraft made to carry enormous tonnage of air-to-ground munitions. And as a result, as Russian artillery also struck this area, as all these forces were moving through, as these arrows are completely encapsulated in blue and red, meaning they were hit by both Chinese and Russian systems, as these Chinese air-to-ground munitions and napalm canisters got a massive spread as they impacted the ground and annihilated these forces right offhand, with others that were moving in the process of being in motion being destroyed as well, as these arrows are completely encapsulated in red and blue and red. As this vehicle was speeding into this area, it was destroyed by a Russian airdropped payload in the form of one of the 1,000-pounders landing right here, destroying it while it was in motion, and the artillery impacting on this hillside right here, along with also additional 1,000-pounders landing in this area as well, annihilating all of these forces that were moving into this area, as these are encapsulated in blue, meaning that these forces right here that were not hit by Chinese loitering munitions or the Chinese napalm canisters or their airdrop munitions, which landed in this general area here, were hit instead by the Russian munitions dropped into this area right here. Their artillery in the form of these 4 impact icons right there, which indicate that Russian shell fire from their 152 millimeter howitzers, their 2 S-19 MSTAs, along with the airdrop munitions from their very potent Su-34 strike aircraft, had impacted and outright annihilated these forces in this area. As these forces were moving behind this destroyed building that was hit by Chinese artillery early on, they had moved out of the area before all of this had happened, and by the time they got here, loitering munitions were overflying the area, as mentioned, and they got into a firing match with these PAP forces. Although there was a thickly wooded area here, they were fully aware that they were behind this wooded area, as the forces that got on this hill could see that they were right here on this road, and they were well aware that the lines extended north and south from this position guarding the underpass. And they could easily yell up and down the line as these forces were moving, including this vehicle here on the very end. We're all moving up into this area, this large grouping, and they could yell up and down the line to one another about what they saw. But it didn't last very long, because the fire coming from the People's Armed Police was absolutely devastating as their vehicles let loose with 30 millimeter autocannon fire, 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine gun fire beneath the remote control 30 millimeter autocannon, as this was effectively attached to it as a coax weapon, and the 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire coming from the APC versions across this field through the woods. And at these forces they could see up on this hill right here, this gradually sloping hill that was between this road and this road right here. This business, again, had been destroyed. It was a rubble pile. Some were temporarily protected by being behind it, but once they came out around it, and the loitering munitions also came in, and these vehicles also fired through this wooded area, as their quadcopter assets could not only see them, but also they had optics within their vehicles that also included infrared imaging, night vision, and more. As their combat data link was fully synced into the ISR surveillance grid, as well as also the AI real-time battlefield data processing network, which guided all of the actions taking place in this and every other battle, the firepower levied upon the Americans was all guided by these systems and was absolutely devastating. As these forces had earlier gone into this cul-de-sac and then they decided to move through this area, they were pounded by artillery fire and destroyed. This intersection in this area right here, by where all these new homes are being built along this outer road in Creedmoor, this is the outskirts of the town of Creedmoor. These forces moving in through this area, moving in multiple directions, because confusion reigned at this point among the American forces, it has to be explained, were all annihilated once the artillery strikes had come in, as 130 millimeter shells en masse came in and struck this area wherein this traffic jam was, and the air power and also loitering munitions and missiles fired from the Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drone into this area was absolutely devastating. And these forces moving through this area again being hit by this JF-17B dropping its entire payload of napalm canisters and free-fall munitions right onto this area, destroying all the forces that moved through here in conjunction with artillery fire, while artillery fire and missiles impacted the forces moving through this area that got stuck in a traffic jam, along with the airdropped ordnance in this area right here, and here from the Russians and their artillery as well. As the other Russian aircraft and artillery strikes in this area annihilated all of these forces right here, and even some among this grouping. The rest, having had moved through here, were spotted immediately and had been seen since the very beginning, moving this direction against the PAP vehicles, who immediately lit them up as soon as there was no obstruction to their fire, meaning no rubble, no hilly terrain from which they could hide behind. So once they got up over this hill, they were able to be lit up by the PAP vehicles, who outright annihilated anybody in this small grouping, including this vehicle and this tiny group right here, and what was left of this group after the airdropped ordnance and artillery shells splashed in this area were outright decimated by the PAP fire and loitering munitions strikes, as by now the loitering munitions were hitting these forces The missiles from the dedicated combat drones were hitting these forces with loitering munitions, as these CH-901As were all armed with the fragmentation warheads, as it was already understood that the Americans operating in this area had no armored vehicles whatsoever at all. All their vehicles were soft-skinned trucks and SUVs and even cars in some instances, which were easily destroyed by CH-901As with fragmentation warheads, which also did the maximum damage to dismounted infantry-type forces, as these produced the maximum shrapnel effect. There was also the HE option for the HE warheads for the CH-901A, which could destroy moderately armored vehicles and groupings of infantry. It was sort of a compromise between the effects of a fragmentation warhead for the CH-901A and the heat warhead, as the heat warhead was made to destroy heavily armored vehicles like main battle tanks. These were equipped with fragmentation, and these devastated these forces, vehicles which were not hit by the CH-901A missiles, which all of these were hit by CH-901A missile fire, as all of these vehicles moving into this area, minus these hit by artillery and destroyed by artillery, were hit by the missile fires, as this missile came and eliminated this on the access road. This one on the access road was hit by a missile. These just off the access road were hit by missile fire, CM502KGs or HJ-10s, hitting this one, this one, this one, and this one, leaving the loitering munitions to basically strike these forces with the ground-based fires. As, again, all of this was absolutely devastating. This was effectively a massive kill box with only two pairs of combat aircraft, one each from the VVS or Russian Air Force of their very powerful Su-34 strike aircraft, and one pair of Chinese JF-17B fighter aircraft, now returning for their third sortie, retasked as strike aircraft, as these were multi-role aircraft in any case, although they were fully capable of being air superiority aircraft due to their outstanding design as a 4.5 generation fighter aircraft, or a bridge between 4th and 5th gen aircraft. They again could perform strike operations just as easily. And being armed with these air-to-ground payloads added to what already was enormous payloads carried by the Russian strike aircraft, and with the addition of the Chinese aircraft returning with air-to-ground ordnance predominantly, minus 2 air-to-air missiles on the wingtips, these aircraft added just that much more weight to the strike capabilities that were aviation-based in this particular battle within Austin. As the combat would wind down again quickly in this absolute proverbial turkey shoot known as the Battle of Creedmoor, which was basically a total rout and slaughter, as it was a rout of the forces fleeing into the area, who got into a massive traffic jam with the dismounts trying to flee in this area being destroyed by artillery, including these forces at this ranch deciding to flee the area being hit by artillery, as well as also missile strikes from these CM502KGs and loitering munitions strikes in the area. It was a total turkey shoot, for a lack of a better phrase to call it. This was a complete total kill box, and at the last move of this operation, these PAP forces, moving south and then hooking to the west, now moved along the access road and engaged these Americans who were right here at this point in time that they had reached this position. They exchanged fire briefly, but the lead IFV annihilated these forces with very potent, concentrated 30mm autocannon fire, 7.62 coax machine gun fire, and now had a sector of fire facing this direction to cut off any retreat of forces that might try to turn back around, which none managed to, as the artillery, loitering munitions, missile fires, and Also, the air power deployed along with the artillery, the combat drones, and the loitering munitions, and the ground-based fires, including what was occurring here, was all simply too much for the Americans to withstand, and this grouping of what was now over 1,000 combatants, including those who had earlier fled from the PAP skirmish a bit further to the slight northeast, who got into this traffic jam bottleneck in this area, were all annihilated by the concentrated fires in this area, with the scenes resembling much like what was in this scene right here, as the combat drones locked on to their targets and fired their air-to-ground payloads. CH-901As crashed into groupings of armed reactionary civilians in the field with their fragmentation warheads and threw the battered, broken bodies of these combatants in multiple directions. The very potent 30mm autocannon fire, even though there were no armored vehicles present in this battle, would shred right through an MRAP with ease and blast it into a smoking hulk of metal, as these two Max Pro MRAPs were on fire, and this M113 was sitting there smoking with gaping holes in it, as the PAP heavy machine guns on their APC versions were also extremely adept for this type of combat against these groupings of armed reactionary civilians in their light-skinned vehicles with their small arms, completely unable to do anything about what was going on, as 130mm artillery impacted in the near distance in this scene, much like what was going on in this battle space. The concentrated 130mm fires coming from all of the firing batteries from this battalion was simply immense. It was enormous, as the 7 firing batteries with 8 howitzers each were given the fire-at-will command, as the coordinates were given to them for their howitzers to train on as it pertained to the positioning of the armed reactionary civilians, guided by the AI real-time battlefield data processing system, as well as the ISR network that linked into it, as the AI notified the FDC of pre-prepared strike packages for their artillery forces. When the fire-at-will order was given, enormous volumes of shells impacted this whole area, even Russian artillery in a few areas as well, with their very potent 2S-19 MSTA 152mm howitzers, the missile fires, the CH-901As with fragmentation warheads, and the ground-based firepower was simply too much, as 50 more armed reactionary civilians at the very end moved down this access road and were immediately spotted by the quadcopter assets of the lead platoon, as well as also the optics of the lead vehicle. They shredded them up as they moved past obstructions and were now in line of sight and were tore up by the lead vehicle of this entire company that had moved into this area to block escape through this underpass. And after destroying these forces, and these forces were destroyed, this battle literally lasted only a matter of 30 minutes, and all of this destruction was effectively achieved, as all of these forces were outright annihilated, again, by the combination of air, artillery, combat drone-based missile fires, and loitering munition strikes, not to mention the ground vehicles in a mass formation, firing at various targets of opportunity and destroying all of them. As the PAP would effectively be then moving through the area, conducting a battle damage assessment and looking for potential survivors, they would really find none in this area, and would see the eastern side of Creedmoor as a charred, cratered, rubble-strewn area of total ruins with twisted vehicles, twisted metal, littering the fields and streets of the outskirts of Creedmoor, much like this, with the deceased, the KIAs, laying strewn about everywhere, and any wounded perishing shortly thereafter due to not receiving any emergency care on time. As this battle was hellishly destructive, the ground-based fires, including from the artillery, was immense. And the air-based fires from the combat aircraft was even more immense. And added to that, the loitering munition and the combat drone making their debut in this battle, showering the area with missiles and these kamikaze drones known as loitering munitions, numbering 48 total loitering munitions deployed into this entire battle space, annihilating targets with ease on their AI target-seeking mode, with the quadcopter reconnaissance assets constantly patching in all the information to the PAP forces in the field and mapping out the entire battlefield in real time with their quadcopter assets and high-altitude assets and satellites all overlaid to provide a real-time, fluid, moving, by-the-second updated, real-time battlefield information update on all positions of enemies and friendly units alike. The Americans had no such thing and were destroyed for it. More to come in the next video, as there would be another flare-up. This time a large militia force would try to attack a Russian CCP regime property upon which one of two brigade headquarters battalions was present upon, which would necessitate reinforcements from elements from two different battalions, as well as also receiving enormous artillery support from Chinese PHL-03 300mm rocket systems firing from Nolanville in the Fort Hood battle space to support the Russian forces, as well as also receiving support from their own artillery and air power, as well as also Chinese air power armed with air-to-ground munitions as well on their third sorties. More to come in the next video of this hypothetical fourth-generation warfare invasion documentary series.